of War of the Flea, and I'm going to go ahead and put the resources in the Jumbotron. So give me just a couple seconds. Hey JB, I'm just putting some things in the Jumbotron real quick. Okay, the PDF of War of the Flea should be in there, and as well as the previous readings, the thread of spaces should be in there. Now I want to put a couple of crowd funds in the replies, so just give me a couple seconds to do that, and then we'll get into the reading. Also, if anyone has any crowd funds that you would like to have like boosted, feel free to put them in the replies. I'm gonna put about 2 more, and then go ahead and get into the book. All right. So I'm on chapter 7. So let me get into it. Chapter 7, Wars of National Liberation and Their Cost. The Irish Troubles and the Role of the Black. It says TANS, terrorism. I'm not sure what that is, but we'll read about it. In Israel, rebellion in North Africa. The price of national liberation can come high, as the toll of the 2 wars in Vietnam bears witness. Yet in general, it could be said that the modern wars of national liberation, those of the remaining colonies and those of the semi-colonies, such as Cuba, have been remarkably economical of human life, as compared with wars between equal states and alliances of states. Actual battle casualties in Cuba, for example, cannot have exceeded a few hundred killed during 2 years of civil strife. Revolutionary sources, immediately after Batista fell, claimed some 20,000 dead as the 7-year toll of police terror under the dictatorship. No listing or other attempt at verification has ever been published, nor have battled casualties ever been totaled. Accounts of individual battles by Guerrilla and others, however, indicate a very modest final figure. In Zanzibar, recently, the toll probably was closer to a few dozen. In Cyprus, it did not go over 3 figures. The same is true for Israel if one counts only the period of hostilities between the Jews and the British and not the Arab-Israeli war that followed. In Ireland, writes Richard Bennett. Hold on, let me grab some water. So also, unfortunately, which I didn't know this author's a Zionist. And it's interesting we keep running into this. The IRA, in its first year of war against England, had killed at most 26 people, 18 of them policemen, and had fired shots in anger at human targets on not much more than 100 occasions. No government, adds Bennett, could capitulate to such a threat. He is wrong. The fact is that England did capitulate, if not to the threat per se, then to the intolerable political and economic situation that it was to produce given another year. Here, yet another illustration of the nature of the war, of the Flea, of which guerrilla tactics is one aspect and terrorism, urban guerrillism, is another. Bombs and bullets are the physical weapons of the rural guerrilla and equally of the urban terrorist, but the real lever for both is politics. Divisions may be destroyed as in Vietnam, but this is not the ultimate objective. Cities may be terrorized, as in Cyprus, but again, this is not the goal. The purpose of the war of national liberation, pitting the feeble resources of a small and primitive nation against the strength of a great industrial power, is not to conquer or to terrorize, but to create an intolerable situation for the occupying power or its puppet government. In the War of the Flea, paramilitary cannonades wreak more havoc than artillery. Headlines burst bigger than bombs. Peace marches win battles where machine guns fail. Casualties are low because guerrillas are fighting campaigns of attrition, shun the battles of attrition common to regular armies. Terrorism, conventionally viewed with pious horror as political murder, but how more murderous than blockbusting a city or napalming a village. Is far more humane, being more selective than most other types of warfare. In the end, the oppressive power relinquishes its grasp not because its armies have been defeated in battle, although, as we have seen, this may occur, but because the satellite, the rebellious colony, through terrorism and guerrilla warfare, becomes one, too great a political embarrassment to be sustained domestically or the world stage, and two, unprofitable, too expensive, or no longer prestigious. The rebel cast himself in the role of David and make it his business to force the enemy into the role of Goliath in the public mind. His every act and announcement play on the sympathies and sense of justice of the global witnesses of the struggle by creating the picture of a courageous people fighting for independence against the monstrous forces of tyranny and oppression. At the same time, the entire arsenal of revolution, guerrilla fighting, terror, sabotage, propaganda, is brought to bear in an effort to take the profit out of colonialism by demoralizing labor and impeding production, boycotting imports, inciting insurrections, forbidding payment of rents to foreign owners, wrecking foreign industrial installations, and in every way increasing the cost of exploitation of a political control, the expense of maintaining the bureaucracy and the police and military forces that must be used to put down the rebellion. Grab some water. Mm. Oh, there it is. If the goal is clearly understood and revolutionary tactics are resolutely applied, the colonial power quickly becomes involved in a struggle that simultaneously blackens it before the world and inflicts financial losses that will soon be translated at home into political liabilities. The very efforts of a colonial power to end the struggle will only accelerate the process, for the more stringent the methods of suppression applied, the greater the hatred of the colonial population for the colonizers, or of the satellite people for the imperialists, and the harsher the picture of oppression to be held up before the world. Note, the world includes the population of the oppressor nation, and more particularly the government's domestic political opposition, which will be sure to raise a hue and cry about the methods used to put down the rebellion, as well as the burden on the taxpayers, the loss of national prestige, and etc., etc. Excellent examples of this entire process may be drawn from the experience of the two great empire builders of the last century, Britain and France. For the former, the struggle that led to the still conditional independence of Cyprus was almost blow for blow, a repetition of the troubles that had freed Catholic Ireland from English rule more than 3 decades earlier. The lessons of Ireland were also applied in Israel. Leaders of the Aragon and the Stern Group studied the writings of the Irish Republican Army commanders, the better to know their enemy and the means by which he could be driven out of Palestine. If not driven out, forced to end a situation that terror made politically and financially intolerable. The purpose of terror, said Lenin, is to terrify. He might have strengthened the observation while weakening the aphorism by remarking that its greater purpose is to sabotage the orderly administration of government by forcing those who govern into a defensive position in which nothing can be accomplished without the continual crippling presence of an armed guard. A secondary effect, if not, its purpose is to induce a counterterrorism that gives rebels the cause better than any stringent than, I'm sorry, I read that really bad. Its secondary effect, if not its purpose, is to induce a counterterrorism that serves the rebel cause better than any stratagem the rebels themselves could devise. So real quick, because I'm kind of reading a lot. So this book that we're reading about guerrilla warfare, I know there's like a lot of parallels to draw, especially with the previous chapter. And the way that this book goes is it kind of paints a picture of the conditions that lead up to a people uprising and forming guerrilla armies and, fighting for liberation. And, as it describes like different systems of basically apartheid and caste systems and segregation that we find in every part of the world because of anti-Blackness, because we live under white supremacy. It's just very interesting as we start reading, you'll start like drawing parallels, is what I'm trying to say. And basically where we're at now is it's mapping out what happens when guerrilla warfare actually takes place. It showed that there was actually like less casualties than you'll see with like empires, using the colonized people as cannon fodder for their wars, and we're losing millions and millions of people. Then when there is a liberation struggle, yes, lives are lost. I'm not trying to minimize that, but what he was making was a comparison of those type wars against imperial powers and those of the people, which actually is less. So I guess it's to paint a picture, or how I guess I'm interpreting it, is like saying that, again, we have nothing to lose by our chains, and that it is the job of the oppressor to constantly condition us, to tell us that we actually have more to lose trying to be free than just staying, oppressed and repressed and being comfortable in that. But if we look, our comfortability comes at an even greater expense. In order for me to be comfortable right now in reading a very convenient PDF version of this book about guerrilla warfare, it was made possible by the enslavement of African children in mines that are owned by other imperial powers that are exploiting those people in today's modern day slavery. I'll continue. Well, so just to tie it into where we're currently at. So basically, he also describes that not only are the casualties less, but also to the way the people, as well, talking about like the entire population of any given area where struggle is found, they oftentimes side with the guerrilla because they themselves are like a part of their community. So it's not some outside force imposing its will upon that community. This is a grassroots developed people, a rising consciousness of people deciding that enough is enough. And even though they're not all on the front lines, they all play a part in creating that community that makes it safe to engage in this type of revolutionary struggle. So on this part, now I'm to this page, and they're explaining how when the empire is like has its back against the wall and is losing, basically they'll throw anything at you. They'll try to paint the narrative of how actually they're the real oppressed, and how they're the black and the poor sit there and try to take our wealth. Like, that is greed. Like, all kind of weird shit. But of course, even more violently, examples in history where, again, whole smear campaigns have been done and altered history to the point where, unless we can find or have the privilege and access to leisure to be able to go research and study in archives, a lot of us won't even know the truth on who is wrong or who's on the right and who's the oppressed. But I'm going off on a tangent, but that's where we are basically. The counterterrorism part is basically them spreading misinformation about the guerrillas and causing mass confusion in an attempts. And when we see these more widespread, though, he warns to not give into despair, that that's actually a sign that revolution is not only here, but you have all the elements aligned. He named will, which is like political consciousness. You have the time, and I forgot the third one. Oh, strategy or some shit like that. But yeah. So that's where we're at here. This was the case in Ireland, where despite a long history of insurrection, public support of the independence movement was lukewarm until fired by the axe of the British themselves. in particular by the depredations of the notorious Black and Tans recruited to strengthen the Royal Irish Constabulary. Of the ill-starred Easter Rebellion raised by Irish nationalists in 1916, 4 years before the Tans were heard of, Richard Bennett writes The Black and Tans. The Easter Rebellion was a sadly mismanaged enterprise. The rebels proclaimed the Republic, occupied a number of buildings in Dublin, and held out bravely for a week. A young mathematics teacher called De la Vera was the last to surrender. There was little trouble in the rest of Ireland. The Irish people declined the nobly worded invitation to prove itself worthy of the august destiny to which it called, and looting Dubliners made way while the shells crashed and the bullets flew. Never in the history of Ireland had a rebellion inspired so little sympathy. There were nearly 100,000 Catholic Irishmen fighting with the British Army, and the rebellion seemed as much as a stab in the back to the majority of Irish people as it did to the English. The prisoners, who were marched through the streets, passed between lines of angry, jeering Dubliners. The cause of Irish independence seemed lost or postponed to some far distant date. At this point, the British made a fatal mistake. They proceeded to shoot 15 leaders of the Eastern Rebellion. The executions caused a scandal that spread around the world and ended any hope of a peaceful solution of the Irish question. The fortunes of the almost discredited Sinn Féin independence movement, provided with the set of holy martyrs, quickly revived. But London went ahead, almost as if deliberately inviting its own defeat by preparing a conscription act. The Great War in Europe was then its progress, and manpower was desperately needed to draft Irishmen of military age. The measure united the country against the crown and sent thousands of young men into the Irish militia, known as the National Volunteers, soon to be converted into the revolutionary Irish Republican Army. England could not have done more to set the stage for the troubles to come. Water. On January 21st, 1919, the Dáil Éireann, the Legislative Assembly of the Sinn Féin Party, declared its independence from Britain and proceeded to constitute itself a de facto Republican government on Irish soil, soon to be complete even to Sinn Féin courts and police. The maneuver was political in intent. Actual war was not envisaged, yet the intention of the Dáil was one thing and the temper of the volunteers another. Scarcely had the Declaration of Independence been signed when the first shots of the revolution were fired. On the very same day, a group of volunteers ambushed a party transporting gillenite into a quarry and killed 2 members of the Royal Irish Constabulary. Scattered, more or less spontaneous, clashes between police and volunteers soon gave way to an organized campaign of raids and ambushes under the direction of Michael Collins in Dublin and of IRA brigade commanders elsewhere. Actual casualties were relatively few, but the effects were remarkable. Helmeted soldiers patrolled the streets of Dublin with fixed bayonets as in a foreign capital under wartime occupation. The docks were piled high with war material, and every delivery of arms or military supplies moving over the roads and required an escort of armed cars and tenders filled with troops. For fear of the IRA, hundreds of political prisoners crowded the jails, and the Crown forces were kept so busy with searches for arms and IRA suspects for more than 20,000 house raids were recorded between January of 1919 and March 1920. By the end of 1919, a bitter struggle was in progress. There you go. Sorry, I lost my place. By the end of 1919, a bitter struggle was in progress that exempted no one, military or civilian. The country had become an armed camp in which assassinations and raids on military barracks were daily occurrences. In Dublin, the atmosphere was such that nearly every important British official connected with the Dublin castle administration, was virtually interned in the castle, and conditions of the soldiers and police in their barracks were not much better. There was little action, but there was no lull in the atmosphere of suspense. Any road might lead to an ambush. The most harmless-looking civilian might suddenly draw a gun and fire. Scarcely a day passed that failed to provide the headline-making Irish incident for the avid British press. Abroad, thanks to Eamon de la Vera's highly effective propaganda campaign among the Irish immigrants in America, sympathy for the rebel cause reached such dimensions that the British envoy to Washington reported himself to be almost powerless for good owing in the universal sentiment in favor of Ireland. 43,000 British troops occupied Ireland, in addition to the 10,000-man Royal Irish Constabulary, soon to be augmented by several thousand black and tans, whose nickname derived from their mixed uniform of military khakis and RIC black sand brown belts, holsters, boots, and cap fissures. These later were joined by some 1,500 temporary cadets of the RIC auxiliary. For controlling the 26,000 square miles of insurgent Southern Ireland, it was scarcely sufficient. Damn. The terrain was ideal for guerrilla fighting, the green, rugged, and in many places virtually roadless countryside being impassable to motor transport during wet weather, which seemed to be most of the time. Let me grab some more. Oh, that. IRA men on the run, as the Irish expression had it, found perfect sanctuary in the bogs and wooded mountains, yet were always close enough to towns and main arteries to launch lightning raids under cover of darkness and quickly withdraw. In the cities, the gunmen of the IRA were so well integrated with the people at large that most of them held regular civilian employment, and the majority of IRA operations in Dublin and Cork were scheduled at night for that reason. There was insufficient manpower available during daylight hours. The IRA action consisted of the greater part of arms raids on military barracks, ambushes of military convoys in the countryside, and attacks on small patrols or individual IRC men and soldiers in the city. Soldiers in the city. There we go. Sorry, I was on a long day. In addition, there was a special squad in Dublin that specialized in assassination of British intelligence agents and political figures. From the military point of view, much of this activity had only nuisance value. Oh, same mistake they made in Vietnam. Newspaper ink flowed more freely than blood. IRA gunmen missed more often than hit their targets. The barracks that burned were often empty, and their destruction only symbolic. Often the raids were repulsed, having extended more ammunition than they had hoped to capture, and the victims of the gunmen were more frequently Irish than English, suspected informers, collaborators, and the like. The IRA was not, however, fighting a military war. It was fighting a political war, and the true effects of the terror were psychological and political. Enlistments in the IRC stopped and resignations mounted as morale sagged. Damn. The troops in their quarters, foreigners in a hostile country lived under a strain which veterans of the war in Europe said was greater than that of the trenches. At one point, the fear of the IRA gunmen had say casual stroller might be a gunman, reached such intensity that a military order was posted warning civilians that any man walking with his hands in his pockets was liable to be shot on sight. Pockets could conceal pistols, and the British were taking no chances. The raids on barracks and convoys may have been ineffective militarily, but they had their effect on the economy and the orderly administration of a country being systematically plunged into chaos. The mere chance of a raid or an ambush anywhere at any time slowed transport, restricted production, and forced the military to stay constantly on alert, to guard all barracks, all convoys, all public buildings, to travel only in strength, to continually screen civilians, check credentials, to check credentials, scratch buildings, to interfere with traffic with all of the multifarious activities of everyday life at tremendous cost to the government, to the war-weary British taxpayer, to the straitened British owner of Irish properties, to investors, the banks, and all who had at stake in an orderly, productive Ireland. Each incident was another damaging blow to British prestige abroad. Each shook British morale at home, and each was sure to be seized upon by the Labour Party and the Liberals as fresh ammunition to be hurled at the Conservative government. If the military could stand the strain, Downing Street could not. Predictably, efforts to control the situation only worsened it. It only worsened it. The Black and Tans arriving early in 1920 were a godsend to the IRA. For every incident the latter produced, the former produced another, and where the actions of the IRA could be admired abroad as a part of a courageous struggle for liberty, the reprisals of the Tans could only draw blame and further unite the Irish in opposition to the crown. Irish propagandists made the most of oppression so that the burning of a few shops and homes became magnified into the rape of entire villages and the summary execution of a relatively handful of faners of suspected IRA men became indiscriminately slaughtered on a major scale. When a divisional commander of the RIC told his men to shoot first and ask questions later, the clandestine Irish bulletin quoted him as having said, "If a police barracks is burned, or if the barracks already occupied is not suitable, then the best house in the locality is to be commandeered, the occupants thrown into the gutter. Let them die there. The more the merrier. Police and military will patrol the country at least 5 nights a week. They are not to confine themselves to the main roads, but make across the country, lie the ambush, and when civilians are seen approaching, shout, hands up. Should the order be not immediately obeyed, shoot and shoot with effect. If persons approaching carry their hands in their pockets, or in any way suspicious looking, shoot them down. You may make mistakes occasionally, and innocent persons may be shot, but that cannot be helped, and you are bound to get the right party sometime. The more you shoot, the better I like you, and I assure you no policeman will get into trouble for shooting any man." The report was duly denied, but it made little difference. So basically, they're saying that's what the police was telling them in order to fight the rebellion. Shit, that sounds exactly like what came over the police scanner in Philly when they had let that other murderous cop off, and the people rightfully started looting the city. And before that all happened, you heard they released a scanner basically saying, "Oh, we get to hunt down some kids, and it won't matter." And it didn't, because they're awesome if they're still making all kind of money on their job and having more and more victims. I'll get back to the reading. The report was duly denied, but it made little difference. It might as well have been true. There was sufficient truth in it and to make it credible, and that was what counted. It was all of a piece with accounts that told of lorry loads of Black and Tans roaring through the village's streets, firing their rifles at random, to the peril of anyone who happened to be in the way, and singing, "We are the boys of the IRC, as happy as can be," quoted the Black and Tans. Whether the Tans actually sang such a ditty on their forays is of little importance. What was important was the reputation they created for themselves and the effects of it. Singing or not singing, they did sufficient irresponsible killing, burning, dynamiting of houses, and drunken pillaging to create a scandal in England, and the scandal aided the Irish cause. The Daily News of London virtually accused the government of secretly convening at the barbarous reprisals now being systemically carried out, and the Conservative Times declared, "Day by day the tidings of the Irish land grow worse. The accounts of arson, destruction must fill English readers with a sense of shame. The name of England is being sullied through the empire and throughout the world by the savagery for which the government can no longer escape. However much they may seek to disclaim responsibility." That is really interesting to read because, as we well know, this system, this oppressor we're trying to fight, has no shame. So there is no There is no strategy that would work if the end goal is to somehow shame the devil. Not at all. I mean, we literally just watch people put their faith into a system. And I think that's also what he describes here too, is that these places that had these types of rebellion, open guerrilla warfare, were already to the point where they were no longer illusioned by institutions, that they started to see exactly what they were and where they occupied in their hierarchy of capitalism and white supremacy and other forms of oppression that we just read about. I guess what I'm trying to say is to like urge us to do the same. Like we're watching again on our phones. Kids get slaughtered, their skin dissolving and their bones exposed, their blood vessels in their eyes bust, like heinous shit at the palm of our hand. And we understand like where this all ties to in the whole history of things and what the root of it is: white hegemonic power, right? So I don't understand why we still think these institutions will somehow indict themselves and come out with a guilty verdict and a ceasefire. Like, it's wild to me how many people have faith in that. And I'm just like, damn, if we're here like this far down into the apocalypse of settler colonialism and we still believe in the institutions that are built to protect them and maintain that system, you know, how can we build something sustainable when all the elements of revolution is literally here at present? People cannot afford to live, they can't afford shelter, and the rich are basically telling people to eat cake. Yo, this is not sustainable. I'll continue. Where the counterterrorism of the Tans and the auxiliary shocked the British public, the martyrdom of various Irish heroes, Terence MacSweeney, Lord Mayor of Cork, who died in Brixton after a hunger strike lasting 70 days, young Kevin Barry, hanged in Dublin for killing a British soldier, captured the sympathy of millions of loyal Britons. The IRA never gained sufficient strength to defeat the British military forces in any engagement of any size, anywhere, at any time, although the British Viceroy, Lord French, estimated it as some 100,000 strong, and the British Secretary for Ireland doubled the estimate, reporting an army of 200,000, ready to murder by day and night. Its peak strength on paper was never more than 15,000 men, and Michael Collins later put the effective fighting strength of the IRA at 3,000. But then, as noted before, the Irish Rebellion was a political rather than a military contest, and the truce that ended it late in 1921 brought a political victory that obviated the need of a military decision. For political victory, 3,000 armed men were enough. Their role was more that of a catalyst than agent. Their militancy had accomplished two things. It had transformed an apathetic population into one actively hostile to British rule, so creating a massive resistance that the English could not economically or, in terms of politics, practically overcome. And it had induced a counterterrorism which, again, for political reasons, defeated its own purpose. If at the end of some centuries of sporadic struggle against foreign domination, the Irish failed to hurl the English invader into the sea, they accomplished something better or more economical. By their resistance, they took the profit out of colonialism and turned the colony from a British asset into a liability, so in effect, persuading the enemy to withdraw. There was nothing very novel about the means employed by the, novel, sorry. There was nothing very novel about the means employed by the terrorists. They were such an ordinary ingenuity might suggest. Fires were set in public buildings. Irish flags were flown with grenades attached to the lanyards to booby-trap the soldiers who came to remove them. Slates were removed from the roofs of police stations and gasoline was poured into the attics to be set afire. Bridges were blown up and rails removed from railroad tracks. Sugar was put into gasoline tanks, sand in crankcases, emery dust in machinery gears. The means of sabotage and of armed aggression were simple, and the actual damage relatively unimportant. What was important was 1. The cost of suppressing such a campaign, and 2. Its political effects on both the Irish and the English people, the one being unified and forced into an active involvement, the other divided and rendered impotent by the same effort, and its consequences. Sorry, I had to get some water. Could the British have won in Ireland by putting a huge army into the field and waging a Cromwellian war of extermination to suppress the rebellion? In the 20th century, the question is meaningless. British public opinion, related always to economic considerations, would not have permitted such a solution, even if it had been considered. A generation later, world opinion forbade any similar approach to the problem of Palestine, the problem of Cyprus, the problem, for that matter, of Suez, where the abortive Anglo-French invasion of 1958 produced global repercussions. Draconian solutions are possible only in isolation, in an indifferent world, and even then, only against a population that has not the will to resist. And Palestine, for example. Okay, let me pay attention to what I'm about to read. In Palestine, for example, the British were able to wage a vigorous campaign against the so-called descendants political faction, the Argun Zavai Lumi. I said all of that wrong and I apologize. And the smaller, I'm going to say lay or stern group, only for so long as the Jewish Agency and other conservative Jewish elements in Palestine and abroad turned their faces against violence. The stiffening of Jewish resistance in reaction to the suppression campaign and to continued British restrictions on immigration, and at last the entrance of the, I don't know how to pronounce that either, sorry, I'm going to say Hagna, into the struggle in 1945, confronted the British with a choice that was no choice. They could declare war on the entire Jewish nation or surrender the Palestinian mandate. They wisely chose to surrender the mandate and leave the question of the future Jewish state to the United Nations. Contemporary historians, even Jewish historians, have tended to depreciate the role of the Irgun and even more that of the sternist in the struggle for Israeli independence. Yet it seems clear that their contribution was vital. It was to create an open struggle without which there could have been no resolution of the issues, without which the British withdrawal might have been postponed indefinitely. The terrorists had no illusions about their ability to free Israel by their own efforts. Argun numbered no more than 2,000 fighting men. Lehigh never had more than 400. Their purpose, rather, was to demonstrate to the British the immense cost in money and manpower of continuing to rule in the face of determined Jewish resistance and to arouse the Jewish people until all Jews were united in opposition to the foreigner. Real interesting. Because as like I read his work and how he can sit there and side with the oppressed in certain struggles, we see how he's on the wrong side on this one. And that happens often. And actually, we can use a more recent example that I'll use social media since we're on it, on the timeline. And you see it in real life as well, is that people will be on the right side of supporting, the resistance against certain oppressions in certain areas for certain people. But if anti-Blackness is pointed out at any given time, all of a sudden that's causing division. Let's talk about that another time. So there are a certain group of people we're willing to see still oppressed and still repressed by the state. Is that you'll see certain people, though, align with certain causes, but not want to interrogate the whole beast. And we got to ask ourselves why. Because we all know if we all like to chant the whole no one's free until we're all free, we got to interrogate that further. Because if we know true liberation only comes when this entire system and all of its tentacles of oppressions are fucking chopped the fuck off, killed, burned, and put into the ash can of history, that none could exist nowhere. Well, then why are we afraid to tackle the anti-Blackness within other respected and oppressed groups or in other oppressed groups? Of course it exists everywhere. Why wouldn't it? This is literally, I want us also to read what's called Jared Horn. I think it's called The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism. We'll read that next because if you don't understand like white supremacy and its roots in this global white hegemony, well, then you won't understand on how to approach liberation struggles. What will end up happening is that you'll have a lot of reactionary responses. For example, right now in fucking Austin, We got these stupid ass crackers of the Red Guard who want to call themselves communists, literally siding with the fascists on the border. It dumb shit like this, but this is what happens when we don't truly interrogate all of the ways in which not only we're oppressed, but then who is the most marginalized and oppressed among us? If you talk to Black leftists, they will tell you exactly who the enemy is and why not to trust these group of people over here. Black people have been saying Red Guard is some feds and that they're fucking fascists, and now everyone's still surprised. Anyway, let me get back to the book because we really need to educate ourselves and fast. Lacking WAP. Oh no, I already read that. Sorry. Let's see. Oh, here we go. There is a point to be made here. If revolution is to be understood as a historical social process rather than an accident or a plot, then it will not do to consider guerrillas, terrorists, political assassins as deviants or agents somehow, apart from the social fabric, irrelevant of only fortuitously relevant to the historical process. Damn, I guess that's just a long ass way to say that it's inevitable to see rebellions and uprisings because you create the conditions in which people cannot live otherwise. Guerrillas are of the people, or they cannot survive and cannot even come into being. Terrorism, while it arouses the people will to revolt, is at the same time a manifestation of that will, expressing the first stiffening of popular resistance to establish authority, the first surge of the popular impulse towards a new and different order of existence. It may be argued that terroristic movements attract criminals and psychopaths, so they do. But criminality itself is a form of unconscious social protest, reflecting the distortions of an imperfect society. In a revolutionary situation, the criminal, the psychopath, may become a good revolutionary as the idealist. In Palestine, those who directed the terror were not adventurers, but a vanguard. In their actions, they expressed the long suppressed fury and frustration of 100 generations of oppressed, spat upon Jewry. More especially, they acted for the living generation, witnessed the final racial catastrophe, the Hillarian bloodbath in Europe, whose shattered survivors were now ultimate insult, forbidden refuge in the land of their ancestors. The seething spirit of the terror in Palestine was vividly voiced in an almost biblical warning to the British published in June 1944. The Lehigh Oren has it after a member of the organization had been sentenced to hang for shooting a policeman. So real quick, the way I hear him describe the takeover of Palestine reminds me of the way crackers describe how slavery happened or how the Civil War happened or how anything in history happened. And that's why I say there's not just parallels, there's understanding that this is all a part of the same settler colonial project. And that is why they must stand together. What we're seeing is class collaboration, honestly, if we would describe it. They know their interest, even though, you know what I'm saying, you'll see people, white empires compete. Yes, they could be competing. They could even be at war. But yet that commonality or goal is that we want to keep white hegemony and keep the global south in a state of repression and prime for exploitation. That is an agreed upon part of settler colonialism. And the thing is that in order for that to exist, you need a very well tuned system of indoctrination. So it's why you can see, like, I read this and I've heard like Zionists talk, and it sounds like people I've heard in Baptist churches in the South my whole life. This whole, we get fed this narrative, again, like Malcolm X accurately says, that will have us worshiping the oppressor and hating the oppressed, and also painting it in kind of revolutionary terms, in a story that we could be proud of siding with fascists for. And that's why you see so many people gleefully doing it now. It's just very interesting. But it's also too why we have to be more discerning. Like, you literally have people falling for the same shit they fell for on January 6th, saying, "Oh, well, that's a sign of revolution." For who? Fascists? Because fascists fight all the time. And you'll see You'll see collaborations between the rich crackers who sponsored that shit and hiring those of lower classes to sit there and collaborate and say, hey, we'll bring a tighter form of white supremacy where you will get even more benefits than now. You won't be equal to me ever, but at least you'll be better than the niggas in this state. And they're like, hell yeah, we'll march for that. And they storm the Capitol. Like, the same shit's happening at the border. And yet you still have white leftists. Again, why I don't work with them, why I say there's no revolutionary potential, but you have white leftists in droves heading down there now. Yo, man, I can't wait to tell you all the shit that's happening out here, bro. It's some wild shit. But I actually have to hurry up because I have to get back out there. There is a point to be made here. Oh, I'm sorry to read that. Okay. Your mothers will lose their sons just as you made the mothers of... Oh, I'm not reading that bullshit. Revolution comes in various ways. It came to French Morocco as a jihad, a holy war, but on by the banishment of the independent-minded sultan, Muhammad bin Yusuf, and the substitution of a puppet, the aged bin Arafat, on the throne in Rabat. I know I'm butchering these names, y'all. Corpses found at dawn in the streets of Casablanca were often those of Muslims who had touched alcohol forbidden by Islam, and especially sacrilege during the time of mourning for the true sultan in exile on the island of Madagascar. When smoke arose from the medians, it was invariably a burning tobacco shop. Tobacco was forbidden by the same religious austerity and boycotted as a French government monopoly. When a lamb was sacrificed in the courtyard of the Sultan's palace, only the shameless attended. Ramadan, the holy month, was not observed by the faithful, another symbol of mourning and protest. Houses went unpainted. Frivolity and ostentation were punished by the swift knives of the... I don't know how to say this word. It says the People's Party. For the rest, the resistance that was to end the French protectorate and restore Moroccan independence followed a familiar pattern: exploding bombs, sabotage, and assassination of Muslim collaborators. Native policemen, postmen, cades subservient to the French, aroused the passions of the people and involved them in the continual conflict with the colonial authorities. Demonstrations in the native quarters grew into riots that overflowed the walls of the median. One after the other, from city to city, they swept Morocco during the hot summer of 1955, and in each the French made the same mistake: panicking police, opening fire on unruly crowds, killing a dozen here, a score there, 30 another place, as the insurrection spread from Casablanca to Marrakesh, Meknes and Fez and Rabat. Across the country, agitators of the Istiqlal incited the primitive Bedouin hill tribes with the tales of impeding liberation. Tribesmen swooping down on the highway town of Oudzem in the broiling Tatla plain massacred 200 Europeans, sacked a nearby mining community. There were uprisings in the middle of Atlas, ambushes on the roads. 8 foreign correspondents were killed on a single day in August. Rioters in Casablanca and Istiqlal, snipers firing from the rooftops threw the city into a state of siege. The persistent cry of the rioters was "Restore Ben Yusuf," but the restoration was only a symbolic objective. Ben Yusuf meant independence and holy war against the French who withheld it. Terrorism was more effective than guerrilla tactics in Morocco. A true guerrilla campaign never developed, although a few hundred raiders from Spanish Morocco began such a campaign and tied up a division of foreign legionnaires and sapphires. Oh, I'm so sorry, y'all. In the mountains of the Rif for some weeks during the autumn of 1955. The struggle ended in the capitulation of the French government, though a series of compromises. The announcement that the Sultan bin Yusuf would be permitted to leave his exile in Madagascar for Paris created jubilant demonstrations in Morocco that forced a greater concession. It would return to Rabat. The departure of the aged pretender bin Arafat set off new demonstrations. The actual return of the Sultan brought the entire Muslim population into the streets, and the 50-year-old protectorate became a hollow pretense which Paris hastily abandoned. The formula followed by the istiqlal was simple enough. Terror and sabotage served the twofold purpose of taking the profit out of colonialism and making the country unsafe for the colonists. The terrorists could not be controlled except by throwing the country into a stage of siege, and the psychological effect of the siege, with its curfews, arrests, searches, and massive military movements, was to bring the Muslim population to the conflict in righteous demonstrations, which no army could suppress. Since a colony that cannot be controlled is of no value and of great expense, the purpose of occupying it as a colony ceased to exist, and Paris, under political pressure at home, wisely accepted a settlement with an essentially conservative independent movement that preserved major French interest in the country. Mm. The victory cannot be called bloodless. Scores died in rioting, and several hundred were massacred in local uprisings as the end approached. Terrorism took a heavier toll of Moroccan collaborators than of the French by far. Y'all, they're killing me with these words. Raticides, these French words, by French troops and the Foreign Legion claimed an unknown number of victims in the wake of the Oued massacre. The French were said to have killed 20,000 Muslims in and around the Tabla plain. The figure was supplied by the Istiqlal and is no doubt exaggerated, but it is established beyond question that villages were bombed and strafed. Jet fighters and bombers were sent into action and the roads rumbled with tanks and weapons carriers for weeks after the Quoid Zem incident. In Old Zem itself, Safavids used artillery to level the native quarter where raiding Bedouins had taken refuge when the first troops had arrived, and heavy tanks rolled over the rubble to make certain there could be no survivors. Damn. So, here's my thing with how this fucking cracker writes, is because, unless I'm misunderstanding it every time I read it, but to me, it makes it sound like he'll say little sneak shit like, oh, the rebels claim that this many of their people were killed, or civilians and people in the villages were killed for aiding the guerrillas. Oh, but those numbers are exaggerated. And I'm like, wait, hold on a goddamn minute. Please. Like, one thing we know is that the empire is not going to tell on itself. So any number that does become public, we should already know by now, this far into the settler colonial project, is probably 3 times, 5 times as much. And we should already know that it shouldn't even take like us having to see pictures of decapitated kids, that the violence that comes with displacing of people, genociding of people, installing an apartheid state, and creating mass displacement, what that does, that is a violent process. And of course, I'm not even just describing Palestine, I'm literally describing America and what Black people have been living since this fucking place was incepted. But let me, man, it has been a long fucking day. And I have about 7 more minutes and then I'll end the space. All right. In Tanzania, a similar solution had been reached. Algeria is another case. It is one that deserves and requires far more space than is available here to recount it. The North African territory had long been regarded as an integral part of France, not merely a colony. It had been settled by the French more than a century earlier, virtually erased by the French, and 1 million French colons considered it their native land. France, still bleeding from the wounds to pride and pocket inflict in Indochina, cannot without a serious struggle relinquish its grasp on its lasting remaining major overseas possession, and so it is not surprising that a major struggle ensued. Urban terrorism, although important, was far from decisive in Algeria, where too much was at stake for the French to permit themselves to be blackmailed into compromise. Full-scale guerrilla warfare began with 70 tumultuous attacks across the country on October 31st, 1954, launched more for their psychological effects than for practical military reasons. The principal stronghold of the rebellion was the rugged Arid mountain region where, as Michael K. Clark has noted, in Algeria in turmoil, an entire army corps could have been wasted. It was apparent from the start that a modern striking force was ill-suited to conditions in the Erez. Heavily equipped units depended on motor transportation, lost much of their mobility in the hills, and were easily outmaneuvered. The rebels slithering through the gullies, and defiles of a region the size of Connecticut and as wild as the mountains of the moon, and every advantage they could have eluded any army corps, and did. The tactics practiced by Mao in China, by Giap in Indochina, were pursued in the 7-year struggle to follow, and little is learned by detailing them. As in Indochina, the Algerian rebels of the National Liberation Front and its allies proved that if they could not decisively defeat a modern army, neither could they be defeated. Although fortunes varied from year to year, and those of the FLN were at low ebb when General de Gaulle finally threw in the sponge in 1962. Resistance never ceased at any time, extending from the Arid to deep in the Sahara over 184,700 square miles of battleground that all the armies of the world could not have pacified, to use the French expression. The ruthless use of torture and counter-terror, a scandal in France, proved that urban rebellion can be crushed. The city of Algiers was brought under control by massive policing with the aid of the large French population of colonels. But the Aras and other mountain regions served as guerrilla sanctuaries until the end. A year after the French withdrawal, descendant Berbers forced in the mountains were seen offering defiance to the revolutionary government established by the FLN. That's fucking interesting because it talks about how the way they were able to squash one of the uprisings is literally bar for bar how they respond to the uprisings here in the imperial courts. Heavy policing, as we see now with the rise of cop cities happening all over in different heavily black populated areas. And then they say with the help of the colons, so the help of the other like colonists, which we already see an uptick of white terrorism on people all over the world as far-right fascism rises. That's what I'm saying. A lot of these things that are parallels that we're drawing are the conditions in which these people and many other people stood up and fought in. I'm almost done with this chapter. A clear-cut military decision was impossible. The accomplishment of the Algerian guerrillas successfully defying French forces 1,000,000 strong was to create a drain on French manpower and the French treasury that was too great. Given the domestic political dissension on the Algerian question that existed for even a major industrial and military power to bear, the protracted war in Algeria finally brought Paris to a painful choice: French prestige, the natural wealth of Algeria, and the political weight of 1,000,000 colons on the one hand, political turmoil, continued frustration, and a deadly drain on the national economy on the other. The War of the Flea had bled France to the point of grave economic anemia and produced a raging political fever that was bringing the home country itself to the brink of revolution. De Gaulle, brought to power in the hope that he would somehow solve the Algerian crisis, opted for peace in North Africa at the risk of war with the very military leaders who had chosen him. The French people, drained and sickened by 7 years of senseless slaughter, in a land still foreign after a century and a quarter of colonization, supported him in his gamble. There was a bloody denouncement to come as the military and the colons rebelled, but it proved nothing, changed nothing. The French presence was withdrawn, and a new flag flew over an independent Algeria. And that's the end of chapter 7. So yeah. So there was a lot covered in there, basically. And it takes a little bit to navigate too. So just real quick, just a quick overview. Basically, he's showing examples of guerrilla warfare and in different ways it was applied. So in previous chapters, which is also in the Jumbotron, right, is that they engaged in full-on guerrilla warfare on terrain and in villages and in the rural areas. In this chapter, we more so go over sabotage and what that looks like. And it might not serve like a military advantage, but what you're aiming for is an economic advantage and a political advantage. Because as sabotage and direct actions start affecting the economy and the pockets of the business classes, they start going to the political class and say, hey, what the fuck are you going to do about this? And then what ends up happening is as the police repression and state repression gets worse, well, that ends up earning sympathy for the rebels, the ones rebelling. because it's like, okay, wait a minute. I'm seeing now y'all are rolling over in tanks, people with tanks. Y'all are killing people. Y'all are spraying people with skunk. Y'all are doing all kind of going over to black sites and torturing people and locking people up for 50 years, hitting nonviolent protesters RICO charges. It starts to gain, people start looking at the systems like, wait a minute, who is this really protecting? So he's saying that with all that happening, that builds a momentum in an environment where political consciousness can grow. As political consciousness grows, people begin to become disillusioned with the institutions around them. You'll see moments and events where people will sit there and say, oh, if we take it to the courts, this will happen, because how else can anything else, it can only be justice served because that's what the courts is for, right? But then you have like a momentous event like we just encountered where, what are you talking about? Like, who are these institutions there to serve? Not the oppressed. They're not for us. So why do we expect them to go against their own interests? So when that becomes a common consciousness, a common understanding, the people start to see their options is not to work within the system or hope to, gain sympathy within institutions that, prop up that said system. Instead, they start to see that the power is within themselves and each other. And then that's when you start seeing revolutionary events happening globally. So that's basically what we read over. So if anyone has any questions, it's no pressure. Actually, I don't have much time, but if there are any questions, feel free to grab a mic. I want to remind people that in replies, there's mutual aids. And then, of course, there's stuff in the Jumbotron. So I want to thank everyone for coming. If there's anything that I need to clear up or any questions you didn't want to ask on a mic, feel free to DM me as well. And I'm going to go ahead and take off. I have to get back out here. And y'all remember to check on each other and look out for each other. And, I always end it. Let's get free.